I'll never forget the moment everything started to unravel. Looking back now, it seems ridiculous that something so small could set off a chain of events that would eventually destroy the life I had spent years building. If someone had warned me where that path would lead, I would have turned around immediately. But that's the thing about mistakes. They rarely announce themselves when they begin. They disguise themselves as harmless moments. I had been married to David for almost 8 years. In the beginning, our relationship felt strong. We laughed together, traveled whenever we could, and spent countless nights talking about our future. Like most couples, we believed we'd always stay connected. But life has a way of changing people. Over the years, David became consumed by work. At first, I admired his dedication. He wanted to provide a better life for us, and I respected that. But gradually, his long hours became longer. Business calls followed him home. Dinner conversations became shorter. Some nights, he barely looked up from his phone before heading straight to bed. I told myself it was temporary. Then months passed. Then years. The silence between us slowly became normal. I wasn't angry at him. Not at first. Mostly, I felt forgotten. There were evenings when I'd sit alone in the living room while David worked late at the office. I'd watch television without paying attention to it, waiting for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. When he finally arrived home, exhausted and distracted, our conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes. How was your day? Busy. Everything okay?
Yeah.
Just tired. That became our routine. I missed feeling important to someone. I missed being heard. Around that time, David's son, Ethan, moved back into the house temporarily. Ethan was 24 years old and had recently gone through a difficult period in his life. A job opportunity had fallen through, and he needed a place to stay while he figured things out. Since I had known him for years, his return didn't seem unusual. He was polite, respectful, and surprisingly mature. Unlike many young adults his age, he actually helped around the house without being asked. If groceries needed carrying, he did it. If something was broken, he fixed it. He always thanked me when I cooked dinner and never treated me like an outsider. Over time, simple conversations started happening naturally. While making coffee in the morning, we'd talk about current events. During dinner, we'd discuss movies or books. Sometimes we'd joke about things happening around the neighborhood. Nothing about it felt inappropriate. If anything, it felt refreshing. Ethan listened when people spoke. He paid attention. He asked questions. I hadn't realized how much I missed basic conversation until then. One evening, after David canceled yet another dinner plan because of work, I found myself sitting alone in the kitchen. Ethan walked in and immediately noticed something was wrong. "You okay?" he asked. I forced a smile. Just one of those days. Most people would have accepted that answer and moved on. He didn't. Instead, he sat down and listened while I talked. Nothing dramatic. Nothing deeply personal. Just everyday frustrations. By the end of that conversation, I felt lighter. It was such a simple interaction, yet it stayed with me, because someone had actually cared enough to notice. As weeks passed, David became even busier. Sometimes entire days went by without us having a meaningful conversation. Meanwhile, Ethan was around almost constantly. The contrast became impossible to ignore. One person seemed distant no matter how hard I tried. The other always seemed willing to listen. I never thought much about it at the time. At least, that's what I told myself. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. I had spent hours cleaning and organizing the house. By evening, my shoulders were aching. Every movement felt stiff and uncomfortable. Ethan had just come home when he noticed me rubbing my neck. "Everything all right?" he asked. I laughed. "I think I pulled something. My shoulders are killing me." He looked concerned. "That bad?" "Pretty bad." Without thinking much about it, I made a casual request. "Would you mind helping with a quick shoulder massage? Maybe it'll loosen things up." For a moment, he looked surprised. Then he nodded.
Sure.
"If it'll help." At the time, it seemed like the most ordinary thing in the world. I had no idea that a single innocent request was about to become the first step toward a disaster none of us could stop. There was nothing inappropriate about it. Ethan simply helped ease the tension in my shoulders, and when he was finished, he went back to what he had been doing before. It should have been an unremarkable moment, something forgotten by the next day. But it wasn't. What stayed with me wasn't the massage itself. It was the fact that someone had noticed I was struggling. For years, I had convinced myself that I didn't need attention. I told myself that being independent meant handling everything alone. Yet that evening made me realize how emotionally exhausted I had become. The next morning, life continued as usual. David left early for work. Ethan stayed home searching for job opportunities. I handled my normal routine. Nothing had changed, at least on the surface. Over the following weeks, Ethan and I began talking more frequently. The conversations happened naturally. Sometimes we discuss current events. Other times we talk about future plans, personal goals, or mistakes we'd made in life. What surprised me most was how easy those conversations felt. There was no pressure, no distractions, no phones interrupting every few minutes. When Ethan asked a question, he genuinely listened to the answer. I couldn't remember the last time I'd experienced that with David. One afternoon, while drinking coffee together, Ethan opened up about his own struggles. He admitted that moving back home had been embarrassing. At 24, he had imagined his life looking very different. He thought he'd have a stable career, his own apartment, and complete independence. Instead, he felt like he was starting over. For the first time, I saw a vulnerable side of him. Not the confident young man who joked around during dinner. Not the helpful son trying to keep everyone happy. Just a person dealing with disappointment. I understood that feeling. Life rarely turns out the way we expect. As our conversations became deeper, I found myself sharing things I hadn't told anyone in years. I spoke about frustrations in my marriage. Not because I wanted sympathy. I simply wanted someone to understand. Ethan never criticized his father. That was one thing I respected. Even when I mentioned feeling lonely, he didn't take sides. He mostly listened. Sometimes he offered advice. Sometimes he simply sat quietly while I talked. Oddly enough, that helped more than anything. Without realizing it, those conversations became something I started looking forward to. If I had a difficult day, I'd wonder whether Ethan was home. If something funny happened, I found myself wanting to tell him about it. The realization made me uncomfortable, not because I believed anything inappropriate was happening, but because I knew I was becoming emotionally dependent on those interactions. That wasn't healthy. I tried convincing myself I was overthinking everything. After all, families talk. Families support each other. There was nothing wrong with that. Yet a small voice in the back of my mind kept warning me that boundaries were becoming blurred. The biggest problem wasn't what I was doing. It was what I wasn't doing. Instead of addressing problems with David, I was finding comfort elsewhere. Rather than fixing my marriage, I was avoiding it. Deep down, I knew that. One evening, David arrived home late again. He barely touched his dinner before opening his laptop. I sat across from him for almost 20 minutes. We exchanged only a handful of sentences. The silence felt heavier than ever. Later that night, I found myself thinking about how different things had become, not only between David and me, but within myself. I was beginning to notice the emotional gap in my marriage more than ever before. And once you notice something like that, it's impossible to ignore. A few days later, Ethan knocked on my door, looking unusually serious. When I asked what was wrong, he hesitated. Then he told me something deeply personal about his life, something he hadn't shared with anyone else in the family. As he spoke, I could see how difficult it was for him. The trust he was placing in me felt significant. When the conversation ended, neither of us said much. But something had changed. For the first time, I realized our connection was no longer built on casual conversations. It had become emotional. And as I lay awake that night, I found myself asking a question I didn't want to answer. Why was I thinking about him so much? After that conversation, I couldn't pretend things were normal anymore. Nothing obvious had changed on the outside. The routines inside the house remained the same. David continued spending most of his time working. Ethan continued searching for opportunities and planning his future. Yet internally, everything felt different. The question I had asked myself refused to go away. Why was I thinking about him so much? For days, I tried to dismiss it. I blamed loneliness. I blamed stress. I blamed the distance that had grown between David and me over the years. But excuses didn't change reality. The truth was simple. I had become emotionally attached. Recognizing that fact should have been enough to make me pull away. Instead, I convinced myself that awareness alone was enough to keep things under control. I was wrong. The more I tried to ignore my feelings, the more conscious I became of them. Conversations that once felt casual suddenly carried weight. Moments that should have been ordinary stayed in my mind long after they ended. I began noticing when Ethan seemed happy. I noticed when he seemed frustrated. I cared more than I should have. And somewhere along the way, I started sensing that he felt the same connection. Neither of us spoke about it directly. Not at first. The unspoken tension lingered between us, growing stronger each week. There were countless opportunities to create distance, countless chances to reestablish healthy boundaries. Instead, we kept finding reasons to talk, reasons to spend time together, reasons to delay confronting what was happening. The emotional connection that had begun innocently was evolving into something neither of us wanted to name. One evening, during a conversation that started like any other, the truth finally surfaced. There was no dramatic confession, no grand declaration, just an honest acknowledgement that our relationship had become something it never should have become. The moment those feelings were spoken aloud, everything changed. Because once the truth existed between us, pretending became impossible. I knew it was wrong. He knew it was wrong. Yet knowing didn't immediately stop it. In many ways, that made the situation even worse. Every interaction afterward carried guilt. Every conversation felt dangerous. Every day brought a new internal battle. Part of me wanted to end all contact beyond what was absolutely necessary. Another part of me clung to the emotional comfort I had been missing for years. That conflict consumed me. I became distracted, restless, anxious. I stopped sleeping well. I constantly worried about being discovered, even though nothing had happened that could easily expose us. The secrecy itself became exhausting. Meanwhile, David remained focused on work, seemingly unaware of the storm developing around him. At times, I almost resented him for not noticing. Then I would immediately feel guilty for thinking that. The responsibility belonged to me, not him. Weeks passed. The pressure continued building. And eventually, cracks began to appear. David started asking small questions. Nothing aggressive. Nothing accusatory. Just observations. You seem distracted lately. Everything okay? You've been quiet. Each question made my stomach tighten. I answered as naturally as possible, but I could feel suspicion beginning to form. The emotional burden was becoming impossible to hide. Even Ethan seemed different, more cautious, more nervous. The easy comfort that once existed between us had been replaced by constant tension. Neither of us knew how to fix the situation. We had created a problem with no good solution. Then came the day everything collapsed. David wasn't supposed to be home early. As far as I knew, he was still at work. I remember feeling relieved to have a quiet evening. That relief disappeared in an instant. A misunderstanding, a conversation overheard at the wrong moment, and a series of details that suddenly connected in David's mind were enough. The exact trigger didn't matter. What mattered was that he saw enough to recognize the truth. The expression on his face is something I'll never forget. Shock came first, then confusion. Then a level of hurt I had never witnessed before. The silence that followed felt unbearable. No shouting. No immediate accusations. Just disbelief. As though the reality in front of him couldn't possibly be real. I wanted to explain. I wanted to defend myself. But every explanation sounded pathetic even inside my own head. Because there was no justification for what had happened. Only choices. And consequences. For several long moments, nobody spoke. Then David finally looked at both of us. The pain in his eyes was far worse than anger. And when he asked a single question, I knew our family would never be the same again. What exactly has been going on? At that moment, the truth could no longer be hidden. And the damage was only beginning. The moment David asked that question, I knew there was no answer that could repair what had already been broken. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. David looked from me to Ethan and back again, searching for a denial, an explanation, anything that would make sense of what he had discovered. Unfortunately, the truth was already written across our faces. When I finally tried to speak, my words sounded weak. I told him nothing physical had happened. I told him it started as conversations. I told him I never intended for things to go this far. But even as I spoke, I realized how meaningless those explanations sounded. The damage wasn't measured by what had happened. It was measured by the trust that had been destroyed. David listened without interrupting. That almost made it worse. There was no yelling, no dramatic outburst, just disappointment. The kind that settles deep into a person's soul. For years, we had built a life together. We had shared responsibilities, memories, plans, and dreams. In a matter of moments, all of that suddenly felt fragile. When David finally spoke, his voice was calm.
Too calm.
He said he couldn't understand how things had reached this point without him noticing. Then he asked a question I still think about today. When did you stop talking to me and start talking to someone else instead? I didn't have an answer, because the truth was that it hadn't happened all at once. It happened gradually. One ignored conversation, one lonely evening, one emotional connection, one boundary crossed at a time. The realization hurt because it was true. Over the following days, the atmosphere inside the house became unbearable. David barely spoke to either of us. Ethan kept mostly to himself. Every interaction felt uncomfortable. Every shared space felt tense. Eventually, Ethan made the decision to leave. He said staying would only make things worse. Part of me knew he was right. Watching him pack his belongings was strangely painful, but not for the reasons most people would assume. What hurt most was seeing the consequences become real. This was no longer a secret. No longer an emotional escape. No longer something that existed only in private conversations. It had become a family crisis. When Ethan walked out the door, he wasn't just leaving the house. He was leaving behind relationships that would probably never recover. After he left, things between David and me continued to deteriorate. Trust, once broken, proved incredibly difficult to rebuild. The conversations we should have had years earlier finally happened, but now they arrived alongside resentment and heartbreak. We talked about loneliness. We talked about emotional neglect. We talked about mistakes. Yet every discussion returned to the same reality. No matter what problems existed in our marriage, I had chosen the wrong solution. Feeling lonely did not justify betrayal. Feeling unheard did not excuse crossing boundaries. Acknowledging that truth became one of the hardest parts of the entire experience. Eventually, David decided he needed space to figure out his future. I respected that decision, even though it hurt. For the first time in years, I found myself completely alone with my thoughts. And in that silence, I was forced to confront everything I had avoided. I thought about all the moments when I could have changed course. The conversations I should have had. The boundaries I should have enforced. The warning signs I ignored because they felt comforting at the time. Most affairs don't begin with a plan to hurt someone. They begin with unmet needs, poor communication, and small decisions that seem harmless in the moment. The problem is that small decisions rarely stay small.
They grow.
They evolve. And if left unchecked, they eventually become consequences. Today, when I look back on everything that happened, I don't see a love story. I see a lesson. A painful one. If you're feeling disconnected from someone you love, talk to them before the distance becomes permanent. If a boundary starts feeling unclear, step back before it disappears completely. And if you ever find yourself seeking emotional fulfillment in places where it doesn't belong, remember this. One moment of comfort can cost years of trust. I learned that lesson too late. By the time I understood it, the family I once had was already gone.